Jerome Powell, the head of the US Central Bank, is now saying the unthinkable, that banks can hold crypto. And in doing so, he acknowledges Bitcoin and the like. Here, indirectly. He also says that he clearly has no problem with Bitcoin here. Because the rumor kept going around that the Fed wants to go after Bitcoin. This all happened during the interest rate decision of the Federal Reserve. So, the central bank here in the US. The interest rates are not lowered, but the thing is complete, irrelevant, because what's happening around this had really massive relevance here. Because now Donald Trump actually came up with the idea to go after Jerome Powell again. And to basically attack and confront him because of, hey, why aren't you lowering the interest rates? And on the other hand, you're responsible for the inflation. He's really going after him hard. And it's already hinting that Donald Trump really wants to take him down. But I've said it before, Donald Trump can't just remove him from his position like that. And additionally, we see how Jerome Powell is confronted by a reporter here at the Fed meeting, or rather, after the Fed meeting during the interview. And he says here that he doesn't want to share any more information about him and Donald Trump. So it looks like there's some serious beef brewing here between Donald Trump and the central bank in the US. And on top of that, we see the central bank starting to open up a bit to Bitcoin. Jerome Powell's speech, in general, where the interest rate decisions were relatively uninteresting here. The interest rates are just staying at 4.25 to 4.5%. So, nothing is really happening here, which was also expected. That's why there weren't any big market dips or pumps or anything like that. The market just kind of took it in stride. Then Powell basically said in his statement, the US economy has made a strong recovery. Inflation is getting closer to the target, but it's still high. Jerome Powell is generally staying cautious here. No pressure for interest rate cuts. At least that's what he's saying right now. Here, the labor market is no longer driving inflation. No rush for interest rate cuts. The Fed is sticking to a gradual approach. So, they're basically looking at things from meeting to meeting. A lot of people were expecting that. Okay, is anything else being done now? If Donald Trump is president now? No, nothing big is happening at all. He says here that the 2% inflation target remains unchanged. Inflation is definitely coming down a bit now, so we're getting closer to the 2% inflation target, even though we still haven't hit it. And he also says there's no clear timeline for any easing here. So, it's kind of like this. Either interest rates will be cut or quantitative easing will be implemented. By the way, in Canada, they're also basically lowering interest rates, and it's being announced. That QE is being implemented now here. So we see that there are now the first central banks actually starting to pump massive liquidity into the market. But what's way more interesting is coming up now. The FOMC meeting here with Jerome Powell. But this is basically the interview that happened afterward. And also here, the story that's currently happening with Donald Trump and Jerome Powell. Let's listen in here. Straight into the interview, which means you always have an FOMC meeting where the interest rate decisions are announced. And afterward, there's an interview where reporters and so on can ask questions. And now let's listen in. What Jerome Powell would be asked here about Bitcoin and how he responds to it. He also mentioned in a previous interview that, in the end, Bitcoin is comparable with gold.
Our role with Bitcoin really is to look at, with crypto, really is to look at the banks. And you know, we think it's, you know, banks are perfectly able to serve crypto customers as long as they understand and can manage the risks, and it's safe and sound. As a good number of our banks that we regulate and supervise do that. You know, the threshold has been a little higher for banks engaging in our role with Bitcoin.
So first of all, we need to point out that now the crazy part is, before I tell you what he said here, that central banks are now being confronted with Bitcoin. I mentioned that in a video yesterday, where the Czech National Bank is now potentially buying Bitcoin. By the way, they would be voting on that today, whether they are going to buy Bitcoin. That central banks now basically have to acknowledge Bitcoin. Oh, here comes someone. What's up? Left. It's already here in action. Now I just forgot where I was. I think I was talking about how central banks are just being confronted with Bitcoin. Christine Lagarde has also been asked about this quite a few times. They always dodged it, but they can't really avoid it anymore. Drum roll. Politicians, Bitcoin, big companies, they just have to put out a statement about Bitcoin now. And Jerome Powell has also said this here. The statement. He says here, our role in Bitcoin crypto is to look at us, the banks. If they decide to carry out these activities within a bank, you want to be absolutely sure that it's a safe and solid activity. We're not against innovation. And this is really happening here. Crazy what's happening here. So, the most intense sentence is the last one. And we need to take another look at that. We're not against innovation here. And here are two confessions involved. First of all, they recognize that Bitcoin is an innovation. That means they understand, like in an evolution, for example. Back in the day, people used to pay with stones, with shells, with sand. No, people never paid with sand. But people did pay with salt, with gold, silver. And then it just kept going. Now there are fiat currencies, paper money. And that's obviously here. The innovation that's taking place here is in the money sector. And that's obviously an evolution. Now it's coming here. Bitcoin is basically the new innovation of money. And then you kind of indirectly say, okay, hey, maybe there's even something better than the dollar. I mean, he's not saying that, of course. That's what I'm reading into it. But Bitcoin is definitely an innovation here. For example, it's comparable to the internet, which is an innovation, or the smartphone, or whatever. And it's pretty wild that this is being recognized here. And the second thing he acknowledges here, because he equates the innovation with Bitcoin, saying we're not against Bitcoin, because that's been thrown around a lot lately. Okay, what's the official statement now? Jerome Powell once said, okay, Bitcoin isn't really a competitor to the US dollar. It's more like gold. But he definitely says we're not against innovation. We're not against Bitcoin because a lot of people have it. I suspect that the central bank is really going after Bitcoin. We see it in Europe too. There it is. Jürgen Schaaf and the Binzel, who somehow put out a fat paper every few months. It's even the one, Schaaf or Binzel, I can't remember which one, but one of them even stepped down. That means that even the people in the central banks in Europe suddenly don't feel like attacking Bitcoin anymore because they might suddenly notice, hey, this is all pointless because our arguments are crap. We're just making ourselves look like clowns, and we're done with the clown show. We need to open up. Christine Lagarde probably isn't at the point where she says, okay, we're now open to Bitcoin and all that. And that's the exciting part, that this is happening here now. That people are starting to open up to Bitcoin, that they're no longer fighting against it. Because in the past, it might have been said, Bitcoin is very bad. Now they're starting to open up a bit, but maybe they're not ultra bullish yet. Now you might not say, okay, hey folks, we want to go all in on Bitcoin, or something like that. But at least they're saying something, I mean. On a smaller scale, they're already saying things like, okay, we recognize Bitcoin, it's an innovation. It's okay. Banks can regulate that. Banks are allowed to use it. They just need to keep a few things in mind. And so on. And that's definitely a huge endorsement right there, but we shouldn't overinterpret the whole thing. By the way, I just arrived at the beach. But we shouldn't overinterpret it either. I would say that's just a neutral position. That's being taken here. And neutral is already a good thing. If the people here aren't being overly bullish, then it's not a problem. The main thing is that they're not massively against Bitcoin. That's already a good thing. And now we have to be careful. There's actually something else happening here. What was really interesting at the press conference here, and hasn't happened in this way before. Now Jerome Powell is actually being confronted about the statements that Donald Trump made, where he said, hey, he might meet with Jerome Powell. He wants to lower the interest rates. He wants to discuss that with Jerome Powell as well, and so on. Then a reporter here asked Jerome Powell about it. Hey, what's up? What's that all about? Did you have contact with Donald Trump? Gonna lower the interest rates? And after Jerome Powell answered, and we're going to take a look at the answer right now. Then, just a few hours or maybe an hour later, the response from Donald Trump followed on social media. Let's take a look at that now. Check out this statement from the reporter who confronts Jerome Powell and asks, what's the situation here actually with Donald Trump? Do you guys have beef or what's going on?
Mr. Chairman, at a event in Davos, or to Davos anyway, the president said he'll demand that interest rates drop immediately. So I guess I have a three-part question. Has the president done this to you? Has he made that demand? Secondly, what is your response to that? And third, what effect, if any, does a president making these kind of remarks have on policy? Thank you.
Three questions. I'm seeing it really as one question, though. So I'm not going to have any response or comment whatsoever on what the president said. It's not appropriate for me to do so. The public should be confident that we will continue to do our work as we always have, focusing on using our tools to achieve our goals and really keeping our heads down and doing our work, and that's how we best serve the public.
Can you just comment on whether he's physically communicated his demand to you?
I've had no contact.
So that's interesting. Donald Trump is taking shots at Jerome Powell, but Jerome Powell is asked, hey, what's your take on Trump's statements about lowering interest rates and all that? And he basically just says, hey, no comment on that. It's not appropriate for him to talk about Donald Trump and his position. Then he's asked, hey, did you have any contact? He definitely says, no, we haven't had any contact. And then he just says, we're just going to keep doing our thing as usual. We have our tools. We know exactly what we're doing. The public can trust us. That we're just going to stick to our plan. Simply, I would say, that's what our normal central banks do here. And we won't let ourselves be influenced by someone like Donald Trump or anything like that. And the way I know Donald Trump, with his ego and all, he's definitely not going to be happy if Jerome Powell just completely shuts him down. Because that basically does it here. Jerome Powell. And he gives here. Donald Trump a massive basket. He doesn't react at all here. Because in the end, that's the craziest thing you can do for such a big ego. Not to answer, but simply to ignore him. To say, yeah, I'm not going to comment on it at all. We'll just carry on with our stuff. I'm just going to ignore you for now. And then something crazy happens. Because just a few minutes later, after that statement came out, did Donald Trump actually post something on social media? You see the post here. I'm just not sure right now if this has a direct connection. Whether this is just a coincidence or not. But the answer he gives here is basically the direct response to the question that Jerome Powell didn't really want to answer. He said, because Jerome Powell and the Fed couldn't stop the problem they caused with inflation, I will do this by unleashing American energy production, dismantle regulations, rebalance international trade, and revive American production. I will do much more than just stop inflation. I will make our country strong again, financially and otherwise. And there's also the question of whether Bitcoin is involved in this effort to strengthen the country. But already here, massive statements. I mean, Bitcoin could also be a tool to strengthen the dollar, to basically fight inflation. But that's just speculation for now. Let's move on here. What you still say here. The Federal Reserve has indeed done a terrible job with the banks. The Treasury Department will lead the efforts to cut unnecessary regulations and will free up lending for all American people and businesses. If the Fed had spent less time on DIY, gender ideology, green energy, and the fake climate change, inflation would have never been a problem. Are we exaggerating the worst inflation in the history of our country? So that's not true, that this was the worst inflation in the history of our country. He's definitely exaggerating a bit here, but in the end, he's doing a complete reckoning. He says, hey folks, the Federal Reserve, you are all a disaster. You guys are absolutely worthless. You have zero control. You are responsible for the inflation here. And in the end, it's definitely true that we really need to say this. Okay, hey, the central banks are responsible for the inflation. When you print money here, I don't know. During the COVID time, they engaged in quantitative easing, and I don't know what else you all are doing. So basically, this is a massive attack against Jerome Powell, against the job of the central bank and all that. And on the other hand, he's making some huge promises here. He's talking about financial stability. We will get inflation under control. I'm really curious about that. Also with the Department of Government Efficiency, because that's a really big issue he's tackling. Of course, if we can bring down energy production and energy costs and stuff like that. And so, then you can get inflation under control. But you really have to, let's say, keep the central bank side in check too. It's definitely a two-sided issue. You can't just say that from one. Look at it from the side. And I was really shocked when I heard those statements. And I think the next one who's really on shaky ground here is Jerome Powell. And I've said before, he can't just fire him. But I mean, when it comes to government stuff and all that, they just find some means or whatever. Then, you just say, you do some pressure lobbying or whatever. Somehow there are ways. How can you really get people out of their positions? Get rid of them. So Donald Trump is really getting straight to the point here, who really wants to do their own thing here. And if anyone here isn't on board, they're just getting kicked out. Super exciting. We need to keep an eye on this, because that also means, if I understood it correctly, that Donald Trump definitely wants to pump liquidity into the market. He's talking about lending and stuff like that. And that leads to more liquidity coming into the market. That would definitely suggest rising Bitcoin prices, because liquidity is just rising globally. Of course, the dollar is moving forward, and that would be good for Bitcoin. Additionally, he talks about financial stability. That actually means he has to include Bitcoin in his balance sheet. Although that's obviously just my exaggerated interpretation here. It could be that this wasn't meant here. Hey folks, we are in absolutely exciting times. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link down below for you to one where you can easily buy Bitcoin safely. Here, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code Bitcoin. See you later, take care. Peace out.